Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I am excited to welcome a new colleague, actually, somebody I only met just a few months ago at a training. Welcome, Hudson Jones.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So Hudson and I were actually, I attended a training of his as he was talking about fathers, and you are a part of the new training, fairly new training of fathers and men and fatherhood issues relating to, becoming a new parent or becoming a dad again for Postpartum Support International. And I really enjoyed the training, and so I'm hoping that we're going to talk today about your area of specialization, which is parenting and fatherhood and NICU parenting specifically. So, could we start with if you could introduce yourself a little bit and tell us about who you are, where you've been trained, and a little bit about yourself?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in California, and I got my graduate degree at the University of Denver in their Psy.D program. And then I came out to San Diego for my doctoral training at SHARP Mesa Vista Hospital here. And then I finished my postdoc at the Center for Men's Excellence, where I really honed my skills working with men and helping parents transition to fatherhood and motherhood alike, really specializing in men's mental health and, supporting dads through the perinatal period. And then within that, I have a little bit of a specialty, like you mentioned, in supporting NICU parents, because that's a bit of a different journey into parenthood, one that can be unexpected at times and kind of increase risk for some mental health complications along the way, just given to the added stress of that, and managing all the different experiences that come with it. And so I did my dissertation on, you know, mental health stigma as a barrier to getting support, when a baby's born in the NICU, for fathers specifically.
So, could we start before we get into the NICU specifically? I would love to talk a little bit more just about men and mental health. I've done previous episodes about men and infertility, but I think we come back to that same theme about stigma, about access to care or willingness to access care in general. But can you give me a sense of what your research, not specific to NICU, but in general, or your work with men? What are some of the things that you've come to really understand about the men's experience of mental health issues or a bit or the challenges that we have in helping men access support?
Sure, yeah. I mean, this has been my interest in mental health since before I even, began this journey. I just uh, growing up as, a man myself, a boy, and then a man. I just experienced the socialization process that's a little gender specific as it relates to mental health and how that can be restrictive. Just given the fact that, men are raised to be strong, they're raised to sort of um, kind of push to the side these vulnerable emotions that are part of the normal human experience, but for some reason, you know, uh, we socialize men not to address those feelings, or it's not as common. And so, how that intersects with receiving support, and mental health support specifically is that going to therapy, talking about what's going on in your life in a vulnerable way, that is kind of counterintuitive to the way a lot of men have been trained to operate. And so, a lot of times when I get a referral for a new therapy client, it's somebody's first time
Mm.
coming to therapy, and it can be a really vulnerable thing, and it's usually oftentimes because things have gotten really bad, because there's a preference to handle it on your own that I see a lot, and then it's only until things are really crumbling that it's like, okay, fine, I will go talk to someone about this.
Right, right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Are you finding it like that somebody else is pushing to them and being like, you need to go get help? Or more, or is there a balance between the male actually saying like, no, I'm in trouble, I need help? What's the kind of the track
I
record?
think both pathways are just as common. You know, working in the perinatal period, I often, get guys coming to therapy because their partners are like, you gotta go, like this is having an effect on me, this is having an effect, on our baby or our child. Oftentimes, things started in the perinatal period, but I won't see dad until kids are, much older,
Mm.
just because they've been trying to hold it together. But just as often, single guys or guys on their own are like, I'm not liking the way I'm showing up. Like, I thought that I could handle this, but like my irritability, my agitation, like, I'm not liking the way that it's affecting me at work. I can't show up for, my partner, my kids, myself, my friends. Like, I'm just feeling alone, isolated, and all this. And so I need to go talk to somebody.
And what are the symptoms that you would see differently, perhaps, than women? What are some of the things that you're saying? Like when they are coming into therapy, I know you led with the idea of irritability, and I'm not showing up the way that I want to. Can you get more clinical with me about what are some of the symptoms that men tend to present with when they're struggling with mental health?
Yeah, totally. So one idea that I've been thinking about a lot lately is this idea of restrictive emotionality, which is like one of the core, tenets of gender role conflict that's been demonstrated in the research that men experience. And to dive a little deeper into what that means, it's discomfort expressing or experiencing vulnerable emotions.
Mm.
And so you think about the perinatal period as a time of increased stress, right? Like you take the normal stressors of managing a relationship and holding down a job and just like living in today's world, and then you stack on top like bringing new life and what that brings, and navigating the medical system and learning how to parent. And so it's just like all these different stressors combined, which, increases risk for mental health and increases the likelihood that you're going to experience some vulnerable emotions like helplessness, hopelessness, anxiety, grief for your former life, or grief for if there's any loss along the way. And I think for a lot of men, they are have had the privilege or have just been socialized to navigate around those
Mm.
difficult emotions, and there's no room or path around them anymore. And so we have to go through, and that brings up a lot of distress. And I think the way that it becomes manifest for a lot of men is like agitation, anger, outbursts, just difficulty regulating that emotion. And then that's leading to relationship conflict. That's leading to, maybe some unhealthy coping mechanisms like drinking or avoidance. Um, and so I see, that kind of presentation a lot. And it's not maybe the the kind of typical picture of depression where someone's like withdrawn or isolated or weepy. They might be more on the sort of like edgy side,
Mhm.
just because that's the way their, poor mood is becoming manifest.
Hmm. And so the restrictive emotion is something that they have learned from childhood, that's socialized. They have been socialized to be more restrictive in their emotion, to man up, to pull it together, to keep it together. And then when you are facing something much more than you can handle or cope with, the reactivity that shows up there is one that is more explosive in nature rather than restrictive in nature.
Yes, because it's both discomfort and experiencing. So I'm having this emotion that's vulnerable to me and it is uncomfortable.
Hmm.
And then
Hmm.
also difficulty and discomfort in expressing. I don't have the language to tell you what I'm feeling or going through. So it just comes out as like, you know, maybe anger at their partner or anger at the world or anger at themselves, anger at the baby,
Hmm.
it's and then they're like, wait, this tiny little, lump of nothingness, how could it's so innocent. Why am I angry at this thing? Why do I
Hmm.
think it hates me?
Right.
And it's very confusing. And so I think what I've found is that when guys do come in, they really like it. It's like, oh, yes, this is nice. Like I like exploring, what's going on with me. I like talking to someone. I like, you know, being understood. I like somebody who's like attuned to the male experience. And then through building, language and understanding around what's going on with them internally, a lot of times I'm focusing on both, comfort and experiencing those feelings, and we'll do that together in therapy, but also, skill and nuance in expressing that with partners and friends and family, so that you can get better support.
What does that look like in therapy? I'm curious when you talk about like helping them become comfortable with that emotion therapy or expressing that emotion therapy. What does that sound like technically?
Well, it looks like making them uncomfortable and feel the feelings on purpose. But there's definitely some timing and tact involved. So
Yeah.
trying to ask questions and express curiosity around those more vulnerable parts of them and their
Mhm.
experience, and sort of giving them an invitation to go there.
Mhm.
And then when I see it, when it starts coming up, trying to gently bring some attention to it and ask them like, "Hey, what's that feel like right now in this
Mhm.
moment?"
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
then a lot of times they're like, "What are you talking about?"
Right, right. That's what I'm imagining. They're like, "Wait, what are we talking about here?" Yeah.
I'm like,
Do you
like
do you have to like avoid the therapist-iness? Like, do you have to like avoid sounding therapist-y when talking to them?
I do try to steer clear of therapist speak, and I really just try to be a person.
Hmm.
And it's not uncommon that we're laughing in sessions, that we're cracking jokes, that we're, not taking ourselves too seriously. But that I think is often like the pathway to more vulnerability because we feel closer, it feels less threatening. And we're just kind of like meeting on that,
Hmm.
that personal level.
I love that. And I'm just curious, like, there's so much conversation around self-disclosure. I'm wondering if you feel like you need more self-disclosure when working with men in order to build that like brotherhood camaraderie. This is a safe place for you to be vulnerable with me. Do you feel like you have to be vulnerable with them as a therapist?
Have to, maybe not, but
Okay.
do I choose to? Yes,
Hmm.
because that's just my style.
Hmm.
I feel like when I am vulnerable, I kind of set the stage,
Hmm.
and it's kind of like an invitation, like, oh, this is what we're doing here.
Hmm.
All self-disclosed now. I have my own anger management workbook from when I went through it during grad school because I was losing my mind. And I tell my guys who are struggling with, emotion regulation and anger, I'm like, hey, that book, that's mine.
Hmm.
That's why I
Hmm.
can teach it to you because I went through
Right,
it
right.
myself. And usually you see the tension just like leave their bodies when I say
Yeah.
that. They're like, oh, okay, cool. Like I'm not judged for this. Like, this is natural. This is human. You know, people with doctorates also get angry too.
You know what's really interesting? I'm having this reaction to what you're saying. This it's almost like I feel like anger is a more tolerated emotion out of the male than it
Yes.
is for women, right? So for women to express anger is so culturally inappropriate. But there's a part of me that's kind of like, oh, yeah, men can tolerate a conversation about their anger and they can hear you talk about your history with anger management because there's something like almost like socially acceptable about that. But yet, when we talk about emotions of helplessness or maybe going more into that vulnerability space, there's so much more challenge for men, I think, to engage in those conversations because it's so socially inappropriate or unacceptable. Am I
Yeah.
accurate in that perspective?
100%. I think a lot of times anger is what we see and what, men themselves are first conscious of and aware of feeling and expressing. But if we dive a little deeper, there's a lot of other emotions that are underneath that are sort of fueling the anger. And a lot of
Yeah.
it is that hopelessness, helplessness, a lot of it's shame,
Hmm.
feeling ashamed of uh, their weaknesses, their perceived flaws,
Hmm.
and and then but shame is not one that is very like socially acceptable or even productive, and so they'll spin that up into some anger because that feels like okay, at least I'm doing something with this.
Mm. Feels more manly somehow.
Yeah,
Like, yeah.
absolutely. It's a way to enact your masculinity.
Hmm. Fascinating. So let's take this into this very niche conversation around NICU parenting. Talk to me a little bit about, if you can, to set the stage of what is the emotional experience of parents moving into the NICU space. Obviously, a NICU, for those of you who are unfamiliar, a neonatal intensive care unit, where there is something about the child development right after the birth that causes the child to be placed in a higher level of care. It's unusual that it would be for only a day. Typically, it would be for several days or weeks at a time. Prematurity would put somebody into a NICU, but also medical fragility. So medical fragility along with prematurity or a known or an unknown or not yet known diagnosis, those would be reasons why a parent would have a child in a NICU. So, I think about this from the perspective of like, I can't bring this baby home. I'm going to have difficulty. I plan to breastfeed and I wasn't able to breastfeed, or I'm going to have to be pumping multiple times a day, or I live far from the hospital and there's so many challenges that go along with it. That's my woman's perspective, along with also the terror of like, is my baby going to be okay? Men come to this from a different angle. So let's start there about what we understand about, in general, perhaps the emotional experience of people parenting with a child in the NICU.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about maybe even before talking about the NICU, just the journey to parenthood itself
Mm,
and all that comes into it. It's like, the expectations of like, what's this going to be like, the preparations that are going on at home. Maybe it's like nesting, getting the nursery ready. It's talking to family members. It's thinking about like, how are my relationships with family members going to change? And it's a lot. And then, you throw this NICU experience into it, and it's like, whoa, okay, now all the things that were already like challenging for me, we have this sort of like medical, maybe it feels like an emergency going on top of it. And so things like, oh, now like the family can't see the baby. Maybe now as the dad, I can't see the baby because it's not, it's too medically fragile. Especially for some of the dads that I'm working with now who had, babies during COVID.
COVID.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even if babies are, medically stable enough to have some contact with parents, that feeling, that first sort of interaction connection with them being sort of interrupted or affected at least by, the baby's medical status and the perceived fragility of them. And so being really maybe trepidatious around um, skin contact, holding, caring for the baby. Like it's just a big disruption on the pathway to parenting that you've maybe visualized for yourself. And that disruption kind of just throws everything on its axis and kind of complicates. And as you said, maybe there's feelings of terror for, the baby safety, for mom safety, because there's often complications there. And the thing that, comes up in the research over and over again for fathers in this experience is those feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, which is sort of opposite to what we think about as, traditional masculine ideology, which is this sort of emphasis on success and power, competition. This is a feeling of powerlessness.
Hmm.
And what do I do with that?
Hmm.
Is
Hmm.
often, some of the kind of like emotional roller coaster that dads can find themselves on top of being pulled in a million different directions. If there's other kids in the home, taking care of them. If there's family members, in town waiting to meet the baby, managing, being the point person, being like, okay, this happened, this is what the doctors are saying, and trying to relay all that information. Maybe they have a job that they're holding down as well. You
Hmm.
know, maybe baby and mom are in different parts of the hospital, So it's like I'm needed in 100 places and I have 100 different responsibilities, all the while experiencing these emotions that I'm not very comfortable with. It's a very complex experience.
And I would say also, it's so rare that somebody's checking in on dad, right? It's so unusual where someone is like, "Hey, dad, how are you doing today? And have you eaten anything? And did you find the coffee machine? Or like, can I catch your breath with you for a minute? Like, let's catch a breath together." And like, I think because the care is rightly emphasized, is kind of rightly focused on mom and rightly focused on the baby, but there is this other really important person that is part of this picture, but yet I think is almost seen very often as like the task doer, like the one who is going to get things done. We so often talk about like at a birth, like what's the father's role? Like, well, he should bring her ice chips. I remember like that was my husband's job, was to get the ice chips. I was at one point, like I had some like sedation, and he brought in pizza. And I will never forget being sedated, but having awareness that the room smelled like pizza. And I was like, that was not your job. Your job was just ice chips, not pizza. He's like, you were out of it. You didn't even know. I'm like, that does not make it better. But, and thank God, a very wonderful and attentive father and husband. But in that moment, like the job wasn't clear. And I think that, so much about, especially I think the way we talk about men in general is like they need a job, they need to be told what to do. And in many ways, it's very helpful. I think it can work that way, but we're not checking in on the emotional experience of fathers because they have a job to do, right? Like, I'm just wondering how many fathers are being like, can you pay attention to me? Nobody even asked how I'm doing.
Yes, absolutely. That comes up in the research over and over again as well. Fathers kind of feeling like on, this periphery, and oftentimes feeling, to your point, unattended to, in those NICU spaces specifically, because as you said, rightfully so, care is targeted towards mom and baby, of course, but it's important to, and the research supports this, to check in, with all the parents involved, and that actually promotes outcomes for baby, for mom, for dad, and for the family itself.
Wait, tell me more about that. What kind of outcomes are better when we check in and pay attention to dad?
So father involvement, whether it's a NICU birth specifically, or, a more traditional pathway, or, expected pathway to parenting, um, and checking in with dad, it's like this is their first sort of foray into fatherhood, into parenthood. And if the providers who are part of that process are, speaking to dad directly, providing him with the information and bringing him into the process along the way, the more that happens, even, during pregnancy and during family planning, if dad's involved in those medical decision making and is really like involved along the way, that predicts that he'll be involved once the baby's born, and involved in child rearing and fathering down the line. And the more involved the dad is, or any parent is in general, the better outcomes that the father has himself, because it increases his parenting self-efficacy, as opposed to feeling like this is something I'm not good at, this is something I have no idea how to engage with. Um, he feels confident and successful, which, promotes his mental health. It also, promotes mental health of his partner, because they're feeling supported, they're not feeling isolated in the process. And then it also supports the attachment with the baby. And that, all of these things are bidirectional and they work together. And so, and a lot of that sort of feeling of involvement and, like I have a place here, I'm
Mm,
important here, I have an impact here, starts with the providers, because they're sending signals, whether they really know it or not, as to, who is someone who's, worth talking to. And so when a
mm.
provider comes to you and says, hey, look, this is what's going on, and how are you doing? What can I do to help you? Or do you have any questions? Like, I want to make sure that you're up to speed. That kind of thing really goes a long way, I think.
Hmm. Did you notice in your training, when you were on the NICU, like when you were on the floor and in the NICU, did you notice, that have you noticed that there have been any changes, or did you try to implement any changes in terms of fatherhood engagement or father engagement to promote fatherhood, I guess you could say? Were there anything that were technically or specifically being done that promotes this?
I think just awareness, that father involvement does promote outcomes for the baby.
Hmm.
Things like kangaroo care are huge. Like dads love that. And, staff loves that. It's really heartwarming. It's like, oh my gosh, like, look at this moment that they're having. And
You want to
sometimes
explain to people what kangaroo care is?
so that's when, the parent is providing skin-to-skin contact for the baby who might, otherwise not be having contact with their parent. So,
Hmm.
just kind of laying on their chest, resting together, and just having that skin-to-skin time, where, parent and baby are connecting both, physically and psychologically, and it really promotes attachment, between a parent and infant.
Hmm.
Uh, and talking about that parenting self-efficacy, I mean, that I think, like I was saying before, so much of the NICU experience can be characterized by feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, powerlessness, and this feels like this is something I can do, and it's
Yeah.
good, and
Yeah.
that is a lifeline,
Hmm.
in the middle of a storm.
And I think what's amazing is I have seen NICU providers, like nurses especially, who are a breed unto their own, really supporting parents as they're going through this. I never really noticed if it was father or mother, but like, you're doing a great job. Look at that, the baby settled on you. Look at how you're like really affirming to the parent that what they're doing is effective, is helpful, is connecting. And also strengthening them as a parent. And I think about that, like when we see fathers doing well in their parenting experience, even though they're maybe hesitating or they're nervous about what they're doing, that when we kind of like, there's a nurtured heart approach which says you catch them being good, right? That's the terminology. It's referring to kids rather than the adults, but it's fine. Same idea, right? Like you
Yeah.
catch them in their goodness and catch them in their success. Never underestimate the power of another person saying to that father, "Hey, you've got this. You're doing a great job. Like, look at how the baby just settled on you. Look at how calm you are." Like that kind of supporting the parenting experience from an outsider's perspective. Because I think that there, even if you're doing it well, sometimes there still can be feelings of inadequacy that you're not getting it right enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that affirming language, I hear you say it and I'm imagining how good that would feel to a
Yeah.
parent who is scared, and really struggling to make heads or tails of what's going on. To be told, okay, I'm doing a good thing, I'm doing well, and it's having this positive impact on the baby. Like I needed that.
Hmm. Hmm. I think one of the things that we learned during COVID, we saw, we've seen this actually with severe birth trauma cases where the mother was unable to be alert and awake when she had her baby, where the nurses kind of intuitively would bring the baby over to the mom. Mom was sedated, baby was well. Or in another case where they brought the baby from the NICU actually and placed the baby on the mother's body. And both of their vital statistics regulated, that
Hmm.
mom's numbers looked good, baby's numbers looked better, and it was almost like this co-regulation of in a very high risk experience, like baby was very unwell or very new and mom was very unwell, but there was this just being together created a physiologic response of stability, which is, I just find that outstanding. But it has to be the same thing with fathers as well. Like it has to be that when, if this is the person who is going to be that safe and stabilizing person in my life, that co-regulation has to exist as well. So
Yeah,
powerful.
absolutely. I mean, it's just amazing that the power to regulate is within us.
Hmm.
That's
Hmm.
all it took is just connection.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think that and what a powerful way to learn about like co-regulation is in those like first moments. And if you have that experience, as a parent, and it's supported by, the staff members who are, at the hospital, for example, how that's such a great, first sort of experience to take with you home, because that's oftentimes when things sort of start to bloom mental health wise, especially
Hmm.
for dads, because they're like in total, kind of crisis mode, crisis management, putting out fires during the NICU experience. It's not till they get home that things start to really crop up. But if you've had that experience in the hospital of kangaroo care and that co-regulation and the vitals sort of stabilizing, as you pointed out, that's something that as a clinician, I will, kind of have dads recall.
Mm,
when you're struggling with, soothing the baby, swaddling the baby, kind of that co-regulation piece, putting them down. Um, I'm like, remember what it's like when you can calm, the baby feels that.
mhm, mhm,
And so that can be like an even like a sort of a pathway to teaching emotion
mm.
regulation for dads.
I love that. I want to explore a little bit more about the shame. Talk to me a little bit more of your experience of what shame is as it shows up for either NICU fathers or just in general with dads. Where does that shame show up and what is it?
Yeah, so I mean, people can be ashamed about, a number of things, depending on their history, depending on their culture. But when I think about men, I think about this piece about restrictive emotionality and the discomfort with experiencing and expressing vulnerable emotions. And I think there's oftentimes and also this other piece around emphasis on success and power, and sort of the combination of those two things that comes up during the NICU experience or during the transition to fatherhood in general. Feelings of powerlessness, increased, experience of vulnerable emotions, and how that can sort of be maybe a shame-filled experience because it is in conflict with what um, many men that I have worked with and know personally have sort of pictured themselves as a father,
Mm,
this strong protector and provider. But then all of a sudden, I do not feel like that. I feel really fragile, and this feels very scary, and I don't know what my role is. And while those emotions and thoughts are uncomfortable in and of themselves, then the fact that that feels like a failure or
mm,
feels like, some sort of yeah, inadequacy, then there's shame on top of that.
mhm,
And then what I know shame to do, which I think is really, true for a lot of men, is it tells you, you know, that's going to be the source of rejection. So don't share it. Don't ask for support on it. Don't let it be known. Keep it to yourself. Bury it, you know. Just exude strength. Even if you don't feel strong, like doesn't matter. Gotta hold it together anyways, because if people really knew how you were doing, then they would tell you something's really wrong, or that it's your fault, or that it's the result of you know, some choice you've made.
mm. How much of this is bred in childhood? Like, how much of this goes back to the way that somebody was raised versus no, this could really just show up from a fully normal, healthy childhood experience, and it just suddenly shows up in new parenthood. What's your experience with that?
That's a, age-old question, right? The nature
Yeah.
versus nurture. I don't know if I could even say. I do think that, the reason that this is such a central experience for men, typically is because of that, just that inexperience with, processing difficult emotions.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think about, I often tell this to my clients, I think about stereotypically painting with broad brushstrokes here, girls in their teenage years and how they're going through, making sense of the complex sort of like social dynamics that are going on. They're calling each other like, oh my gosh, can you believe that so and so said this? I felt so worried and afraid about blah, 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 and really kind of just getting into the nitty-gritty of their subjective experience of school, of relationships, of, what have you, where, and this is pulling from my own experience, so it
Sure.
might be very different for other people, but I've found that a lot of guys relate to this. It's like, if a guy sort of tries to bring that into their like circle of teenage boy friends, and they're like, "Hey, like I've been feeling worried," like, "What are you talking about, man? Like,
Yeah.
that's weird,"
Yeah.
and it's like, okay, I'm never saying that again.
Right.
So
Right.
then you think about that over time and just the inexperience that I think a lot of guys like show up to adulthood and parenthood with it, like processing, expressing, experiencing vulnerable emotions.
Mhm.
Um, when they're like finally faced with it, it's like, oh my gosh, I'm out of my depth.
Yeah. And you know what I think is so fascinating is then we expect, that if they are, partnered female and the female's like, let's talk about our feelings. And the guy's like, I have no idea what you want from me right now. Like I have no clue what that it means. And I feel so weird that you're like, what do you want me to talk about? Right. Yeah, it's like it's really a recipe for total disaster, which is fascinating that it works so many times. But like really that ability to express emotion, Danny Singley was giving, I know he's your mentor and friend, Danny was talking about at the conference, he was saying like, teach our men the most important thing you could do is express emotion in front of your sons. Like to
Mhm.
say, I'm having a really hard day and I'm feeling so frustrated, or like I'm having a hard day and I feel very, just sad about how things played out in the office today or whatever. But like he said, when you express emotion to your child, then your child begins to learn how to express emotion appropriately and vulnerably, and then that vulnerability, that willingness to be vulnerable transmits into their open relationships with their future partners and spouses as well. He was like, we can change it now for the future. And I really was giving a lot of thought to that of like, how do we create an environment where it's okay for a parent to be really nervous, scared, overwhelmed, and be able to express that. I always share a story when I teach about in my grief and loss training where I had a client that they came to me to make a decision. I always find this so funny that like they're coming to me to discuss whether they should have another baby. But like, we were never trained in how to guide people in doing that. Just for clarity.
That didn't
And
come up in
no,
school.
it never came up in my social work program. Like nowhere was there like it was never one of the objectives of the class. So this was part of the conversation. She'd had significant losses and had come off of another very significant loss, meaning late term loss pregnancy. And after the conversation, and I looked at him and I said, and how do you feel about this? And he was like, nobody's asked him. Like the assumption was like he's just going to go along with her, and it was the first time that anybody even asked him how he felt. And I had another case where a similar idea and, talking about the future. And I said to him, what was it like? His wife had almost a near death experience. And I said to him, what was it like to watch her knowing that she might die? And he burst into tears. And he's like, you're the first person, we're talking 8 to 10 months later. He's like, you're the first person who asked me that question. Nobody asked me. I was sitting there with the baby that had died. It was a stillbirth and a full term stillbirth. And mom was critically ill, sedated. And nobody asked dad, how you doing? And I think about like, that space of, and it was what I always find so fascinating is if you say to her, what is it like for him to see him express this emotion? She feels so connected to him. She feels so
Mhm.
like in love with him, frankly, because
Yeah.
it's that like that vulnerable space is actually where we connect the best, but yet culturally or, socially, not acceptable.
Right, right. And I think for a lot of dads, and this is very encouraging for me, and Danny says this all the time, fatherhood as an inflection point. I think a lot of dads, especially today, are really motivated to get their emotional house in order for their kids. Because
Mm,
I think they know, they feel that they feel the sort of short end of the stick that they got as far as socialization and regulating emotion goes, and that got them in my office, and they're like, I don't want that for my kid, so
mm.
I'm gonna do what I have to do with you, Hudson, and you can ask me those stupid, shrinky questions that make me feel all my feelings, and I'm gonna keep coming because I know that it's gonna be better for my kids, it's gonna be better for my partner, it's gonna be better for me, in the long run, even though right now I'm really annoyed with you.
But I also think I think we have to be honest that I think about the narrowness of the population of the people that you're seeing. I mean, how few people are actually getting help and support and a rewiring
Mhm.
of, fatherhood and what it could be to be a parent that actually experiences safely and expressively emotion and difficulty. Um, and I come back to that, like that shame conversation about what could we do differently? if we are raising boys or we are married to men, right? What can we do differently that more directly addresses that reality that shame can show up so quickly and so easily in emotionally vulnerable situations?
Yeah, it's a great point, right? Like, sure, I have this one perspective as a therapist who sees men, but if you zoom out, that's not the case for most people, right? Most people,
Exactly.
therapy's unaffordable. They don't have the time. Like, maybe there's not even therapists in their area. Like, if they're living in a rural space, like, who knows? There's all sorts of reasons that it's inaccessible. And so, what do we do more broadly to kind of change the water that men are swimming in, or that we're all swimming in, frankly, because emotionally healthy men is good for everybody.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's more conversations like this. This is why I get so excited to do things like come on this podcast or do my trainings, with Postpartum Support International, because I think it just kind of wakes people up to like the sort of the cultural standards that keep men boxed in,
Mm,
that unless we're bringing it to our attention, sort of continue to play out and the status quo is maintained. So talking about what this is like for men, these restrictive emotionality, and inviting them to be more expressive, to be more curious about their emotional experience. I remember, not too long ago, working at a mental health hospital, and we were doing our rounds, and one of the nurses was like, "Well, that's okay because men don't have emotions anyways." And this is a mental health
nurse.
hospital, and I was like,
Yeah.
"Ew, um, mental health, uh, expertise here. Men do feel things just as much as women. And so just kind of, that alone, I don't fault her for that, right? That's just a symptom of the greater, you
Sure.
know, like cultural forces that happen to be alive in her at the moment.
Hmm.
And so I think it just takes conversations
Hmm.
uh, that sort of change the way we think about men's experience in the world, and hopefully that brings more curiosity, more openness, and you know um, really ends up being an invitation for men to step into that, because I try to sort of couch it in masculinity ideology, that like being more in touch and aware and comfortable with your own emotional self is strength.
Mm,
It makes you so much stronger if you know all the dark corners of your heart that you try to avoid, to like put on this strong front. That actually, is a house of cards. And
mm,
if you get pushed into those really vulnerable corners, you're going to fall apart. But if you, take the time and do the work to explore them, you're going to have so much more safety and strength within yourself.
hmm.
And so that's kind of, um, I think that's what will eventually remove the shame, um, that so many men feel when they're, put in a context where they're in touch with these vulnerable emotions.
Hmm. So interesting. And I want to come back to that one. You did make one comment about very often that the fathers like hold it together in the NICU. And because our conversation primarily is, I mean, I feel like we talked more about masculinity and men than NICU, but that I'm okay with that. But if we take it back to that NICU for a moment, and you said often they're like holding it together in the NICU, but then that shame and vulnerability shows up after when they go home. I know I've seen that research, but explain it a little bit. Why is it that it's like I can hold it together and be the strong and be okay with my emotional experience of it enough, but then I go home when the baby comes home and things begin to decline very rapidly? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so the sort of mechanism there isn't, completely understood. This is mostly speculative, but if we just kind of put our research hats down and just our clinical hats on for a second and think about the lived experience of that, it's not too hard to imagine going into crisis management mode, where, and I think, a lot of things we've been talking today sort of points to the fact that that men can often be good at compartmentalizing. They're like, all right,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
on the shelf, and we're gonna, do what needs to be done. We're gonna get all the ice chips and all the pizza, and talk to all the family members, and do the things that need to be done to get through this experience. And I will attend to my, self later,
If
and
at all.
if at all. And then
Mhm.
the dust settles and it's quiet and no one's reaching out anymore. And, you know, um, leave is up in a week. And
Yeah.
it's like, then maybe the stress starts coming back. Then maybe you start having nightmares,
Mm.
about the experience. And then that's just taking a hit on your mood. Maybe, with the lack of sleep and the increased stress, that your mental health really just starts to take a dive. Whereas the adrenaline of it all
Mm.
is getting you through, but then when that wears off, you're sort of left with, all these sort of like bruises and scrapes psychologically that, really, really need attending to, but you've never had to do that before. So you
Hmm.
don't know what to do. You don't know what this is. You're like,
Right.
a lot of guys, what is happening to me?
Hmm. Hmm.
Something must be terribly wrong. And so,
Mm.
again, to the shame piece, it's like if we can spread the word that this is a normal thing, that this happens to a lot of guys, a lot of parents, and that you get better with help, I think that will really kind of take a lot of the shame out of it, increase help seeking, um, and just result in a lot more, frictionless or supported um, journey to parenthood for these
Hmm.
dads with babies in the NICU.
I think about it also like, some of it really can be even clinically relevant PTSD, right? Like it's kind of like what the heck just happened here? Or what just happened to my family? Or I couldn't save or protect my child from all this and I took care of everything that needed to get taken care of, but now that this baby is finally safe and home, I can finally confront all the emotions that went into being the strong man. And I don't, like you said, I don't really know what to do with all those emotions because I've never felt these emotions before. And also, they were terrifying. Like, it was really scary to almost lose
Fair.
my baby, lose my wife, lose control, lose, the outcome that we thought. And so I'm thinking from, a practical perspective, I think anybody who's listening to the podcast, remember that when you have that outcome that's positive, baby survives, baby comes home, everybody's well. Usually that's the comment. Everybody's great. Oh, thank God, baby's home, right? You must be so happy. But maybe there's some check-in that's really valuable, especially male to male. If a father can say to another father, "Hey, baby finally came home from NICU, but how are you actually doing?" Because it could be even harder emotionally when baby comes home and I'm like, I'm here to listen. But I also recognize that that language sounds very therapist-y and also very feminine. And so, right? And so, yet we have to push the limits a little bit to be able to check in with the men in our world of like, how are you actually doing? And, one of the things I like to say, the Hebrew word for thank God is Baruch Hashem, thank God. And so men will say, oh, Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem. And I'll say, stop Baruch Hasheming me. Like, tell me how you're actually doing. And it's a
Yeah.
joke, but it's also a realistic, like, I know God is good and I know we're thankful. And also, how are you really feeling? And so sometimes, like, the cultural response is thank God, but
Yeah.
the emotional response is much different and very often like I don't have the right to feel scared or overwhelmed or like vulnerable because the baby is okay now. And so like where do I even place my emotions? Sometimes culturally or even religiously, it feels out of place. Like I need to be okay or I should be okay because the outcome is a positive one. So just wanted I feel like it's important to just kind of remember that we can say thank God and also I'm really not okay. Or I would love to talk to another dad who's been a NICU parent and for those of you who are around others, like consider asking those questions of like a real authentic check-in, not just like, hey, so you're doing well, you're doing good, you're good, right? That's not checking in.
Mhm.
Any last words and thoughts on misconceptions around either fatherhood, misconceptions around parenting via NICU, and that will close out our conversation for today.
Yeah, one, I guess, really interesting fact from the research that I like to highlight is that this study taking a look at the incidence and severity of PTSD symptoms following a NICU birth, found a really interesting finding was that it wasn't the length of stay or the severity of, the infant's medical issue, either rated by the physician or by the parent. Those factors weren't related to or predictive of the severity or incidence of PTSD symptoms.
Hmm.
What was related to or predictive of the severity and incidence of PTSD symptoms was the amount of concurrent stressors.
Hmm.
So if there was job loss going on, and change in where you live, if there was other like family medical
Financial. Hmm.
issues, financial, any legal problems, and the amount of concurrent stressors that were stacked upon, the stress of the NICU experience, was positively correlated with the severity and incidence of PTSD symptoms.
Mm.
So it's not always like, how sick is your baby, how dire is the situation, but more so what else is going on in your
Mm.
life. And just to kind of be aware of that for the people in your life who, are, expecting, or if you're a provider who works in these spaces, asking around the NICU
Hmm. Hmm.
experience, in addition to, what was the NICU experience itself like.
Excellent. Any other misconceptions? I'll ask you for one more.
That's a good question. I mean, I really liked your point about really checking in. That I think comes up, maybe more than anything, is that um, you know, everybody's home, everyone's well, is it Barah Hashem?
Yes.
Yeah. Barah Hasheming all around. Um, But then dad feels like alone and isolated in his terror that he
Hmm.
experienced, and
Hmm.
doesn't know what to do. So your point about like maybe wanting to talk to other dads, that
Hmm.
comes up a lot in the research,
Hmm.
that feeling like a safe space, and dad's being like, oh, like that this isn't all just like, sunshine and rainbows. This is really tough in a
Yeah.
lot of ways. And while I am, so thankful and have so much to be grateful for, like I'm still reeling from
Right.
that.
Right.
And
Right.
kind of just a shout out to other dads to be there for each other. That's
Absolutely.
a really, really long way.
I love that. I love that. And I think it's a good thing to remind us, like, if you have this lived experience, one of perhaps a potential meaning making event is to say, I'm going to reach out to other fathers who will eventually who may have this experience in the future. And I will be there to just kind of be like, hey, I had this, I experienced this. We can talk about it. We can encourage our men and fathers to consider doing that to help our community. So, Hudson, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. This was amazing. And really, thank you for spreading this information and knowledge into the world.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been great to be here. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Sure.